The Winchester rifle's cold steel pressed against Eli Callahan's shoulder as he crouched beside his frost-covered window, watching shadows move through the howling blizzard. 3 nights running, something had been circling his cabin, like a predator testing its prey. The tracks he'd found each morning were human small boots, a woman's stride, and the telltale marks of children dragging their feet through deep snow. Tonight, he'd catch whatever devil was stalking his homestead. The wind screamed through Copper Creek Canyon like the voices of the damned. And Eli pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the pain. The storm had been raging for 4 days now, the worst blizzard to hit the Colorado Territory in living memory. Just like the storm that had trapped his boy Thomas in the Silver Point mine. The scratching sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic, coming from directly beneath his boots. Someone was clawing at the planks of his root cellar. Eli's blood ran cold. He'd built this cabin with his own hands after burying his wife Sarah and 5-year-old Thomas in the frozen ground of Devil's Backbone Cemetery. 5 years of solitude, 5 years of keeping the world at bay. And now something was trying to claw its way into his sanctuary. He grabbed his kerosene lamp and moved toward the trapdoor, rifle ready. The metal hinges groaned as he lifted it, and a stench rose from below that made his stomach clench. Smoke burned flesh and the sharp tang of mortal terror. "Please," a woman's voice whispered from the darkness, rough as sandpaper. "They're just babies." Eli lowered the lamp into the cellar, and 8 pairs of eyes stared up at him like cornered wolves. Children, the oldest, maybe 12, the youngest, barely walking. They were huddled in the corner like refugees from the 7th circle of hell. Their clothes singed, their faces streaked with soot and dried tears. But it was the woman shielding them that made Eli's breath catch. She was maybe 30, with prematurely gray hair and a jagged scar that ran from her left ear down to the corner of her mouth. Her hands, dear God, her hands were raw with fresh burns, the skin blistered and weeping. Yet her eyes blazed with a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of a she-wolf defending her cubs. "You planning to turn us in for the bounty?" She asked, her voice steady despite the violent trembling in her limbs. Eli studied the children more carefully. A boy about 10 thin as a whip, with burn marks across his back that looked deliberately inflicted. Twin boys who couldn't have been more than 6 identical, except for the way one rocked back and forth in silent anguish. A girl with her left arm hanging useless at her side. And in the center of it all, a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 3, her thumb stuck firmly in her mouth, staring at him with eyes that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. "How long since you've had food?" he asked instead. The woman's composure cracked like ice over a spring thaw. "Days. Maybe a week. Lost count after the fire." "Can you get them up these stairs?" "Some of them. The others." She gestured helplessly at the wounded children. "They're hurt bad. Real bad." Eli looked at the burn marks on the boy's back again, and his blood turned to ice water. Those weren't accidents. Someone had pressed hot metal against a child's skin deliberately, methodically. The same way the mine bosses had branded the children they'd used as slave labor, the same way they'd marked his Thomas before the cave-in killed him. "Stay put," he said, lowering the trapdoor. "I'll bring food and blankets." As he moved around his kitchen, gathering bread and milk and whatever else he could find, Eli fought against the memories threatening to overwhelm him. Thomas's small voice calling, "Papa, Papa," from beneath the collapsed timbers. Sarah's face gray with dust and death when they'd finally dug her out 3 days later. The mine supervisor's cold smile as he'd explained that accidents happened, and the company bore no responsibility for trespassers. His boy had been 5 years old. These children were barely older. When he returned to the cellar, then the woman was tending to the burned boy with strips torn from her own petticoat. Her hands never stopped shaking, but they moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen too much suffering. "Name's Jane," she said without looking up. "Jane O'Rourke." "Eli Callahan." I know who you are. You're the man who lost his family in the Silver Point disaster. Eli's jaw tightened. What's that matter to you? Means you understand what it's like to watch the innocent suffer. Jane finally looked at him, and her eyes held a pain that matched his own. Means you might understand why I couldn't let them burn. Burn how? In the equipment shed at Black Rock Camp. Jane's voice dropped to a whisper. 12 children locked inside. 12 children who'd become too damaged to work the claims anymore. The bosses decided they were worth more dead than alive insurance money, you understand. Jesus Christ. I got 8 out before the roof collapsed. Jane's hands went still. The other 4, I tried, but the smoke was so thick and the beams were falling. You saved 8 lives, Eli said firmly. That's what counts. Tell that to Deputy Dunn. Tell that to the posse that's been hunting us across 3 counties. At the mention of the name, the burned boy, the one Jane called Amos, looked up sharply. Something flickered in his eyes, a recognition mixed with primal terror. You know him, Eli said. It wasn't a question. Amos nodded slowly, his young face carved with premature lines. He's the one who made these marks on me. He's the one who said I belonged to him. Belonged to him how? Amos pulled his shirt aside, revealing the burn marks more clearly. In the lamplight, Eli could see they weren't random scars. They were letters crude but deliberate, S.D. Silas Dunn. Jane said, her voice bitter as wormwood. He brands his property so everyone knows what belongs to him. His property. Jane's eyes met Eli's across the dim cellar. These aren't all orphans, Eli. Some of these children are Dunn's own blood. Born to women he raped in the mining camps, then abandoned when they became inconvenient. Amos spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of someone far older than his years. My mama tried to tell folks the truth. But who's going to believe a camp whore over a deputy with a badge? So he had you branded. All of us, he fathered. Said if we ever told anyone, he'd gut us like fish and leave us for the coyotes. Amos's voice was matter-of-fact, like discussing the weather. He likes hurting people, especially women and children who can't fight back. And now he's hunting you. He's hunting Jane, Amos corrected. Calling her a witch, a child stealer, a murderer. Anything to make folks forget what really happened at Black Rock Camp. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the storm's howl, many riders moving fast despite the blizzard. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as he moved to the window. A dozen mounted men had materialized from the white hell outside their leader, a tall figure with a star glinting on his coat. Deputy Silas Dunn, no doubt about it. Get them down, Eli said urgently. All of them, and keep them quiet. But before Jane could gather the children, Dunn's voice boomed across the yard, somehow cutting through the screaming wind. Eli Callahan, open up. We're here on official business. The little girl Ruthie Jane called her stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the door, with eyes wide as silver dollars. Jane scooped her up, whispering, just like hiding from the bad men, sweetheart. Can you be brave for Mama? Ruthie nodded silently and disappeared into the cellar with the others. Eli waited until the trapdoor sealed shut, then opened his front door to face the storm. Deputy Silas Dunn stood 6 feet tall in his boots, with pale eyes like winter ice and a carefully groomed mustache that spoke of vanity even in the wilderness. His badge gleamed as if polished for the occasion, and his gun hand rested casually on his holster. "Oh, hell of a storm," Eli Dunn said, stepping into the cabin without invitation. "Mind if we warm ourselves by your fire?" "State your business, deputy." Now that's no way to greet a lawman, especially one who's come to help you out of a dangerous situation. "I'm not in any situation." "No, no." Dunn's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. "Because I've got reports of a desperate fugitive in these mountains. Woman named Jane O'Rourke. Goes by the Witch of Copper Creek in some circles. Never heard of her. Really, because she's quite the local celebrity. They say she can kill a newborn baby just by looking at it. Say she can curse a man's bloodline with a single touch. Dunn walked around the cabin like a predator marking territory. Of course, I don't hold with such superstitions. I deal in cold, hard facts. What facts? Fact, Jane O'Rourke burned down half of Black Rock Camp 4 nights ago. Fact, she kidnapped 8 children from their lawful guardians. Fact, she's armed dangerous and probably insane with grief over her own failings. Eli kept his expression neutral. And you think she's here? I think you're the type of man who'd harbor a fugitive if the sob story was pathetic enough. I think you've got a weakness for lost causes. Dunn's pale eyes glittered. I think you never got over losing your precious boy. The words hit Eli like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. My son's death has nothing to do with this. Doesn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to replace him with someone else's brats. Problem is, these particular children belong to their rightful guardians in the camps. Their guardians locked them in a shed and tried to burn them alive. According to who? According to a madwoman who's got more blood on her hands than Lady Macbeth. Dunn's voice hardened. I've got signed testimony from a dozen witnesses who saw Jane O'Rourke set that fire herself, who saw her dragging those children away while they screamed for help. That's a damned lie. Is it? Because I've also got testimony that she's been practicing black magic for years. Cursing women in childbirth, killing their babies, corrupting innocent children with her evil touch. Dunn stopped directly over the trap door, and Eli's heart nearly stopped. From below came the faintest sound, a child trying to muffle a cough. What was that? Dunn asked, tilting his head like a hunting dog. Rats, Eli said quickly. Been trying to poison them for weeks. Rats. Dunn's hand drifted toward his gun. Funny thing about rats, Eli, they don't usually whisper prayers. Before Eli could respond, another sound drifted up from the cellar so faint it was almost nothing. A child's voice, barely audible, Our Father who art in heaven. Dunn's smile widened like a wound. Praying rats. That's a new one even for the Colorado Territory. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. But here's what I know, Jane O'Rourke is somewhere in these mountains, and she's got those children with her. And when I find her, she's going to hang from the nearest tree. Dunn moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Eli, you might want to be careful about the company you keep. Folks around Devil's Backbone don't take kindly to those who consort with witches. Terrible accidents tend to befall men who harbor evil. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. After Dunn and his men disappeared into the storm, Eli waited a full hour before opening the trap door. The children looked up at him with eyes that had seen the very worst of humanity, and Jane's face was pale as fresh snow. He knows we're here, she said. He suspects. He'll be back, with more men, more guns, more lies to justify whatever he plans to do. I know. Jane climbed out of the cellar, her legs shaking like autumn leaves. Why didn't you turn us in? He would have paid you handsomely for the information. Eli looked at the children, at Amos, with his branded back at the twins clinging to each other, at little Ruthie, who hadn't spoken a word since her ordeal began. He thought about Thomas, about the trust in his boy's eyes, right up until the mine walls came crashing down. Because, he said finally, someone has to stand between the innocent and those who'd hurt them. Someone has to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. Even if it costs you everything. I've already lost everything once. What's left to take? But even as he spoke the words, Eli knew they weren't true. He was already starting to care about these broken children, about their fierce protector. And caring meant having everything to lose all over again. For 8 days they lived like hunted animals in the Colorado high country. Eli would venture out before dawn to check his traps and tend his livestock, always scanning the white wilderness for signs of Dunn's men. He found evidence of their presence everywhere. Boot prints in the snow-broken branches, where they'd forced passage through the timber, even cigarette butts scattered near his property line, like breadcrumbs marking their territory. They were being watched. Constantly, methodically. Jane stayed with the children, teaching them to move silently through the cabin, to hide at the first sign of danger, to trust no one but their small family. She was remarkable with them, infinitely patient, unshakably gentle, fiercely protective. She cleaned their wounds with boiled snow water, mended their clothes with thread pulled from her own garments, and somehow found ways to make them smile, despite the horrors they'd endured. All except Ruthie. The 3-year-old remained locked in her silent world, following Jane like a shadow, but never speaking, never crying, never showing emotion beyond the constant thumb-sucking that had become her sole comfort. She was a ghost of a child, present in body but absent in spirit. She watched them kill her mother. Jane explained one evening, as they sat by the fire, their voices barely above whispers. Watched the camp foreman beat her to death with a pick handle because she was too sick to work the sluices. Sweet Jesus. 4 years old, and she saw her mother's skull split open like a ripe melon. After that, she just stopped. Stopped talking, stopped trusting, stopped believing the world could be anything but cruel. She trusts you. Maybe. Or maybe she just knows I'm the only thing standing between her and the abyss. Eli studied Jane's profile in the firelight. The scar on her cheek looked like a lightning bolt in the flickering shadows, but her eyes were gentle as she watched the sleeping children. "How'd you get that scar?" he asked. Jane's hand went unconsciously to her cheek. "Man named Garrett Welsh. Said I'd cursed his wife during childbirth, caused her to lose the baby. Said he was going to mark me so everyone would know what I was. Did you fight him?" "Tried to. But he brought 3 friends for moral support. They held me down while he used a broken whiskey bottle to carve his judgment into my face." Jane's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "Said every time someone looked at me, they'd remember what happens to witches." "Where is he now?" "Dead. Crushed in a mine collapse 2 winters back." Jane met Eli's eyes. Some called it divine justice. Others said it proved my curse was real. "And what do you say?" "I say that sometimes the only justice we get comes from unexpected places. And sometimes it takes longer than we'd like." The next morning, Eli woke to find Jane gone. He searched the cabin frantically, but she wasn't there. Neither was the canvas satchel she'd been carrying since their escape from Black Rock Camp. "Where's Jane?" he asked Amos, trying to keep the panic from his voice. The boy looked worried. "She said she had to fetch water from Devil's Creek, said she'd be back before the sun climbed above the canyon rim." But the sun was well above the rim now, and Jane was nowhere to be seen. Eli grabbed his rifle and winter coat, but Amos caught his sleeve. "She said if something happened to her, we should trust you completely," the boy said. "Said you were the first decent man she'd met in longer than she could remember. Nothing's going to happen to her. But if it does, it won't." Even as he spoke, Eli felt the cold weight of dread settling in his stomach. Jane had been gone too long. Something was very wrong. He found her 3/4 of a mile from the cabin, surrounded by a mob of townspeople with murder in their eyes. She was on her knees in the snow, her hands bound behind her back, with rough rope blood streaming from a gash on her forehead where someone had struck her with a rock. "Look at the witch!" shrieked a woman Eli recognized as Mary Henderson, the baker's wife. "Look at those devil's marks on her hands. See how she trembles," called out another voice. "That's the evil trying to escape her cursed body." "She's killed more babies than the plague," shouted a third person. "My cousin's wife lost her child after this demon touched her." Eli could see what had inflamed them. Jane's hands were covered in old scars, thin white lines that crisscrossed her palms and fingers like a spider's web. But he knew what they really were, scars from emergency surgeries performed with whatever tools were available, from reaching into dangerous situations to save lives others had written off as lost. "She's a midwife," he said, pushing through the crowd. Those scars are from her work saving lives. Saving lives. Mary Henderson's face contorted with rage. She's the angel of death. Every woman she touches loses her baby within the year. That's not true, isn't it? Deputy Dunn stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the pale sunlight. Because I've got sworn statements from 4 mothers who lost their children after Jane O'Rourke laid hands on them. 4 women who'll testify she cursed their babies in the womb. And I can give you the names of 40 women whose babies she saved. Are you going to arrest her for being good at her job? I'm going to arrest her for kidnapping 8 children from their lawful guardians, for arson, for practicing witchcraft in violation of territorial law. Dunn's voice rang with false righteousness. And for corrupting innocent children with her demonic influence. The only corruption here is what those children suffered in your mining camps. My mining camps. Dunn's pale eyes glittered dangerously. I think you're confused, Eli. I'm a lawman, not a mine owner. But you take their money. You look the other way when they abuse children. You help them cover up their crimes. Those are serious accusations. I hope you can prove them. Eli looked at Jane, who was watching him with something like resignation in her eyes. She'd expected this confrontation, had probably known it was inevitable from the moment she'd chosen to save those children. Let me see your hands, he said to her. The crowd murmured angrily as Jane held up her bound hands. Eli took them, gently turning them so everyone could see the network of scars. These marks, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, are from delivering babies in mining camps, where there's no proper medical equipment, no clean water, no help when things go wrong. They're from reaching into places no one else would dare go to save lives no one else cared about. Pretty words, Dunn sneered. But words don't change facts. And the fact is, Jane O'Rourke is a dangerous criminal who's going to hang for her crimes. Over my dead body. That can certainly be arranged. The crowd pressed closer, and Eli realized they were outnumbered at least 20-1. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but he knew it was hopeless. He couldn't shoot them all, and they knew it. Please, Jane said quietly. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not letting them take you. And I'm not letting them kill you because of me. Her eyes held a depth of pain that made his chest ache. The children need you alive, Eli. They need someone who'll fight for them when I can't. You're not going anywhere. Yes, I am. Because if I don't, they'll burn down your cabin with all of us inside. Won't you, Deputy? Dunn's smile was cold as a January wind. The law requires me to eliminate threats to public safety, by whatever means necessary. But if I surrender willingly, you'll leave the children alone. I'll see that they're returned to their proper guardians in the camps, where they belong. And if they resist, then I'll use appropriate force to ensure compliance. As they began to drag Jane away, she called back over her shoulder, Take care of them, Eli, especially Ruthie. She's the most fragile of all. I will. And don't let them take the children back to those camps. Promise me. Whatever happens, don't let them go back to that hell. I promise. But even as he made the vow, Eli wondered how he was going to keep it. He was one man against an entire town, and they had both the law and the mob on their side. That night, the temperature plummeted to 20 below zero. The wind howled through Copper Creek Canyon like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick Eli could barely see his own barn 30 yards away. In weather like this, even a healthy adult could freeze to death in minutes. The children huddled around the fire, their faces pale with cold and fear. Little Ruthie had developed a fever, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Without proper medical care, she might not survive another night. Where did they take Jane? Amos asked, his young voice tight with worry. To the territorial jail in Devil's Backbone, I imagine. Are they going to kill her? Eli looked at the boy's face, so young, so frightened, yet already bearing the weight of terrible knowledge. Not if I can help it? Well, how there are too many of them, and they have the law on their side. I don't know yet, but I'll figure something out. Now, what about us if you can't save her? What happens to us? Eli looked around at all of them, the twins holding each other for warmth, the little girl with the slowly healing arm, Ruthie burning with fever despite the fire's heat. They were all looking at him with the same desperate mixture of hope and resignation that he'd seen in too many children's eyes. "Nothing bad is going to happen to you," he said. "I give you my word." But what if I give you my word? It was a promise he had no earthly idea how to keep. But it was also a promise he was prepared to die defending. The next morning brought Dr. Marcus Webb to his door, looking nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "On for a morning, Eli," Webb said, refusing to meet his eyes. "I heard there might be sick children here." "Who told you that? Does it matter I'm a doctor? If there are children in need of medical attention, I should help them." Eli studied the man's face. Webb was thin and balding, with soft features that suggested he'd never thrown a punch in his life. But something in his eyes, a stubborn determination, surprised Eli. "Come in," he said. Webb stepped inside and stopped short when he saw the children. In the harsh morning light, streaming through the frost-covered windows, their injuries were even more apparent. The burns, the bruises, the unmistakable signs of systematic abuse. "Dear God," Webb whispered. "What's been done to them? You really want to know?" Webb swallowed hard. "I've heard stories about what happens in the mining camps, about the children who work the claims. These children were locked in an equipment shed and left to burn. Jane O'Rourke saved them. The woman they're calling the Witch of Copper Creek. The woman they're calling a midwife who actually cares about her patients." Webb knelt beside Ruthie, who was lying on a blanket near the fire. Her fever had worsened overnight, and she was barely conscious. "How long has she been like this?" "Since yesterday, getting worse by the hour." Webb examined her with practiced hands, his expression growing more grave. "Pneumonia. Advanced stages. Without proper treatment, she'll die. Very likely. She's so young, so weak from malnutrition and trauma." Webb looked up at Eli. "I can help her, but I'll need supplies from my office, medicine, and I'll need to monitor her condition closely." "Will you do it?" Webb hesitated. "If word gets out that I'm treating the witch's children, they're not the witch's children. They're just children who need help." "I understand that. But the town, they're terrified, Eli. Terrified of Jane O'Rourke, terrified of what she might have done to these children. They believe she's cursed them somehow." "And you? What do you believe?" Webb looked down at Ruthie, whose small chest rose and fell with obvious effort. "I believe she's a very sick little girl who needs medical attention. And I believe any God worth worshipping would want me to help her." He stayed for 4 hours, treating the children's injuries and giving Eli detailed instructions for their care. When he was ready to leave, he pressed a small brown bottle into Eli's hands. "Laudanum," he said, "for the fever and pain. 3 drops in water twice daily. And Eli, yeah, be very careful. There are people in town who'd rather see these children dead than admit they might have been wrong about Jane O'Rourke." After Webb left, Eli spent the day caring for the children as best he could. He fed them thin soup made from rabbit bones, cleaned their wounds with boiled water, and tried to keep Ruthie's fever down with cold compresses. But as evening approached, he realized their situation was even more desperate than he'd feared. The townspeople had begun to gather at the edge of his property line. He could see them through the windows, men and women carrying torches and wearing expressions of righteous fury. They were no longer content to wait for Deputy Dunn to handle the situation through legal channels. They wanted immediate justice. They wanted blood. "They're getting closer," Amos observed quietly. The boy was standing at the window, his young face grim with understanding beyond his years. I see them. What do they want? They want you all dead. They think if they kill you, they'll be safe from whatever evil they believe Jane brought into their lives. And what do you think? Eli looked at the boy, really looked at him. Despite everything he'd suffered, despite the terror and pain and abandonment, Amos was still trying to understand the world around him. Still trying to make sense of why adults did the things they did. I think, Eli said carefully, that people do terrible things when they're afraid. And right now, they're more afraid of admitting they were wrong than they are of committing murder. So they'll kill us to avoid feeling guilty. Some of them would. Others are just following the crowd because it's easier than standing up for what's right. And Deputy Dunn has his own reasons for wanting you dead. Reasons that have nothing to do with witchcraft or curses. Amos nodded slowly, his dark eyes far too knowing for a child. Because we know the truth about him. Because you know the truth about him. Around 11 o'clock that night they came in force. Eli woke to the sound of shattering glass and angry voices raised in a chorus of hatred. He grabbed his rifle and rushed to the window, his heart sinking at what he saw. At least 60 people surrounded his cabin, their faces twisted with righteous fury in the torchlight. They'd come prepared for siege warfare. Callahan. Deputy Dunn's voice boomed across the yard. Send out the witch's spawn, or we'll smoke you out like vermin. They're children, Eli shouted back. They're tainted, corrupted by her evil magic. They're innocent victims. Nothing touched by Jane O'Rourke is innocent. A rock crashed through another window, and the children pressed together near the fire. Ruthie was delirious with fever, calling weakly for her dead mother in a voice that barely qualified as human. You've got 1 minute to send them out. Another voice yelled. After that, we're coming in. And if we have to burn you out, added a third, so be it. Eli looked at the children, at Amos trying to be brave for the others, at the twins clinging to each other, at little Ruthie so sick and helpless. He thought about Thomas, about the trust in his son's eyes, right up until the mine walls came crashing down. Not again, not these children. Amos, he said quietly. Get the others to the back corner, behind the woodpile. It's the most protected spot. What about you? I'm going to try to talk sense into them. Mr. Callahan, do it now. But before Amos could move, something extraordinary happened. The crowd suddenly parted like the Red Sea, and Jane O'Rourke walked through their ranks like an avenging angel stepping out of biblical prophecy. She was alive. Bloodied, beaten, her clothes torn, and her hair wild but unmistakably alive. And in her eyes burned a fury that made even the mob take an involuntary step backward. Stop! She commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a sword through silk. All of you, stop this madness. The crowd went silent, staring at her as if she were a ghost materialized from their collective nightmares. Impossible. Deputy Dunn stammered, his face draining of color. You were locked up, chained in a cell. Chains can't hold someone fighting for her children. Jane replied, her voice ringing with authority. And lies can't stand forever against the truth. You're under arrest for escape for what? Jane stepped fully into the torchlight, and everyone could see the fresh bruises on her face and the rope burns on her wrists and the way she favored her left side where someone had kicked her. For saving 8 children from burning to death, for caring for them when no one else would, for giving them food and shelter and love. For practicing witchcraft, someone in the crowd shouted. For practicing medicine, Jane shot back. For delivering your babies when no one else would come, for saving lives you'd written off as lost. She raised her scarred hands, and they looked like battle flags in the flickering torchlight. Look at these marks, Mary Henderson, who delivered your son Robert when he was born breech, who stayed with you for 18 hours while you bled and never left your side until he drew his first breath. The baker's wife shifted uncomfortably in the crowd, but said nothing. Thomas Wright, who saved your daughter Alice when she was born with a cord wrapped around her neck, who breathed life into her lungs when she wouldn't take her first breath on her own. A man near the back looked down at his boots, his face flushed with shame. Catherine Mills, who delivered your twin boys when you couldn't pay a doctor, who took chickens and vegetables instead of cash because she knew you were struggling. One by one, Jane named them. One by one, she reminded them of the lives she'd saved, the children she'd delivered, the families she'd helped. And one by one, they began to look ashamed of themselves. "Now she's lying," Deputy Dunn shouted, but his voice sounded desperate now, like a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble. "She's trying to bewitch you with her silver tongue." "The only bewitching here," said a new voice, "is the spell of lies you've been weaving." Everyone turned to see Dr. Webb pushing through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his hand like a shield. "I've examined those children," he announced. "There's nothing supernatural about their injuries. They're the result of deliberate, systematic abuse by adults who should have protected them. You're lying to save your own hide. I'm telling the truth to save theirs." Webb pointed toward the cabin. "Those children have been beaten, burned, starved, and tortured. The only person who's shown them any kindness is the woman you're calling a witch." "Then explain the curse." Dunn's voice cracked like thin ice. "Explain why babies die when she touches them." "Babies die," Webb replied with clinical precision, "because they're born in mining camps, with no sterile conditions, no proper medical equipment, no adequate nutrition for their mothers. Jane O'Rourke has saved more lives than she's lost. Far more." The crowd was wavering now, uncertainty creeping into their voices. Some were beginning to remember the times Jane had helped them, beginning to question the stories they'd been told. But Deputy Dunn wasn't finished. His pale eyes had gone wild with desperation, and his hand was moving toward his gun with the deliberate slowness of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Lies," he said, his voice rising to a shriek. "All of it nothing but lies. Jane O'Rourke is a witch, and she's going to burn for it." "On what charges?" Eli called from the cabin doorway. "On the charges of witchcraft, kidnapping, and corruption of minors." "What law says a woman can't save children from burning to death?" "The law of decent, God-fearing people." Dunn's voice cracked like a whip. "The law of Christians who won't tolerate evil in their midst." "Then you'd better arrest me too," Dr. Webb said steadily. "Because I've been treating those children. And if helping sick children is evil, then I'm guilty as sin." "And me," said another voice from the crowd. Catherine Mills stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Jane delivered my twins when I had no money for a doctor. If she's a witch, then I owe my children's lives to witchcraft." "And me," Thomas Wright added reluctantly. "She saved my daughter Alice. That's worth more than all the rumors in the world." One by one, other voices joined in. Not the whole crowd, maybe not even half of them, but enough to make Deputy Dunn realize his grip on the situation was slipping like sand through his fingers. "Enough!" he roared, drawing his gun. "I'll end this blasphemy right now." But as his finger tightened on the trigger, something happened that no one could have predicted. Little Ruthie appeared in the cabin doorway. The 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken a word in months, who'd been burning with fever and barely conscious, walked out into the torchlight with her thumb in her mouth and her huge eyes fixed on the crowd. "Mama," she said in a small, clear voice that carried across the sudden silence like a church bell. She was looking directly at Jane, reaching for her with tiny hands. The crowd went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to pause in its howling. She spoke, someone whispered in amazement. The little one spoke. Jane fell to her knees in the snow, tears streaming down her scarred face as Ruthie ran to her on unsteady legs. "Mama," the child said again, throwing her small arms around Jane's neck. "What kind of curse?" Dr. Webb asked quietly. makes a traumatized child speak for the first time in months? What kind of evil makes a little girl call someone Mama? She's not cursed. Jane said, her voice breaking with emotion. She's healing. For the first time in her short life, she feels safe enough to hope. But Deputy Dunn's face was twisted with rage and something else, something that looked like pure panic. This proves nothing. The child is probably simple-minded, corrupted by what? Interrupted a new voice. The crowd turned to see Liza Walton walking toward them through the snow. Liza was the town's most established midwife, Jane's longtime professional rival, a woman known for her sharp tongue and uncompromising standards. If anyone should have been leading the charge against Jane, it should have been her. Liza, Jane said, genuinely surprised. I've been doing some thinking. Liza announced, her voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. About what's really been happening here. About the stories we've been telling ourselves to sleep better at night. What stories? Deputy Dunn demanded. The story that Jane O'Rourke is a witch instead of a skilled midwife. The story that she kills babies instead of saving them under impossible conditions. The story that she stole these children instead of rescuing them from certain death. Liza's eyes were hard as flint. The story that lets us ignore what's really happening in the mining camps. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Liza pulled a folded document from her coat. I've been to Black Rock Camp, Deputy. I've seen the conditions there, and I've seen the financial records. What records? The ones that show payments made to certain law enforcement officials to look the other way during operational difficulties. The ones that detail which children were considered expendable and why. Liza's voice could have frozen hellfire. The ones that prove Jane O'Rourke was telling the truth all along. Deputy Dunn's face went white as fresh snow. Where did you get those documents? From the camp supervisor's office. Jane wasn't the only one who suspected corruption, Deputy. Some of us have been keeping our own records. That's theft, that's evidence, Liza interrupted. Evidence of what's really been happening to these children. Evidence of why you're so desperate to silence Jane O'Rourke permanently. She turned to address the crowd directly. How many of you knew there were children as young as 8 working in those mines? How many of you knew they were being systematically abused and chose to look the other way because it was profitable? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people began to drift away, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. And how many of you, Liza continued relentlessly, were willing to call a woman a witch rather than admit you'd failed in your most basic duty to protect the innocent? Well, that's enough. Deputy Dunn's voice cracked like breaking glass. Jane O'Rourke is a criminal, and she's going to hang for her crimes. What crimes? Eli called from the cabin. Saving children from burning to death, caring for the sick and wounded, doing what the rest of us were too cowardly to do. She's a kidnapper and a murderer. She's a hero who put her life on the line for children nobody else gave a damn about. The crowd was becoming deeply divided now, some still shouting for Jane's blood. Others beginning to look genuinely ashamed of their participation in the mob. But Deputy Dunn was beyond reason now, his pale eyes wild with desperation. I don't care what any of you think, he snarled, raising his gun again. Jane O'Rourke dies tonight, and so do those children. This corruption ends here and now. No, said a small but steady voice. It doesn't end here. It ends with you. Everyone turned to see Amos step out of the cabin. The 10-year-old boy walked straight up to Deputy Dunn, his young face set with grim determination. You want to know about corruption, Amos said clearly. You want to know what really happened in those mining camps. Boy, you get back inside before... You want to know who really hurt us, who really branded us like cattle. Amos pulled off his shirt despite the freezing cold, revealing the burn marks on his back. But now in the torchlight, everyone could see what they'd missed before. The burns weren't random. They formed letters crude but unmistakable SD. Silas Dunn. Amos said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. That's your name, isn't it? Your mark burned into my flesh? I've never seen this boy before in my life. Haven't you? Amos reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gold ring. This fell out of your pocket the night you branded me. The night you told me that if I ever spoke about what you did to me and my mother, you'd gut me like a fish and feed me to the coyotes. The crowd stared in horror at the ring, at the initials SD engraved on its surface, at the burn marks on Amos's back that matched it perfectly. You're lying. Dunn's voice rose to a shriek. You're all lying. Am I? Amos looked back at the other children who were now standing in the cabin doorway despite the danger. Show them, Marcus. One of the twins rolled up his sleeve, revealing an identical burn mark. Sarah, show them your shoulder. The little girl with the broken arm turned around, and there it was, the same ring-shaped brand that marked her as property. Timothy, show them your back. The other twin lifted his shirt, revealing yet another matching burn. We all have them. Amos said, his voice steady despite his youth. All of us. Because you didn't just abuse us, Deputy Dunn. You owned us. Owned you? Someone in the crowd gasped. He's our father. Amos said simply, the words dropping into the silence like stones into still water. Mine and Marcus's and Timothy's and Sarah's. He raped our mothers in the mining camps, and when we were born, he had us branded like livestock, so everyone would know we belonged to him. The crowd erupted in shocked voices, but Amos wasn't finished. My mother tried to tell people the truth. He continued. Tried to get help from the law, from the church, from anyone who would listen. But who's going to believe a desperate woman working in the camps over a deputy with a badge and a reputation? You're lying, Dunn screamed. You're a disturbed child. I'm your child. Amos shouted back, his voice cracking with emotion. We're all your children, the ones you brought into this world through violence and then tried to destroy when we became inconvenient. The crowd was in chaos now. Some people were shouting for Dunn's blood, others were trying to get away from the ugly truth being revealed, and a few were staring at the children with dawning horror and understanding. It's not true. Dunn's voice was breaking completely now. They're lying. The witch has poisoned their minds against me. The only poison here is you. Jane said, standing up with Ruthie still clinging to her. You're the one who hurt these children. You're the one who tried to murder them. And you're the one who's been calling me a witch to cover up your own crimes. I'll kill you all. Dunn raised his gun with a shaking hand, but before he could fire, Eli's rifle cracked through the night air. Deputy Dunn screamed and dropped his weapon, clutching his shattered shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers as he fell to his knees in the snow, his face twisted with pain and shock. I should have aimed for your heart, Eli said, stepping out of the cabin with his rifle still ready. But these children have seen enough death for one lifetime. You shot me. You shot a lawman. I shot a child rapist and murderer, Eli replied coldly. And I'd do it again without hesitation. The crowd was pressing closer now, and for the first time in his life, Deputy Dunn looked genuinely afraid. You can't do this to me. I represent the law. You represent nothing but corruption and evil, Liza Walton said. You're less than nothing. What do we do with him? Dr. Webb asked. We turn him over to the territorial marshal, Eli said. Let the proper authorities sort out his crimes. And if he tries to escape before they arrive, he won't, Eli said, chambering another round. Will you, Deputy? Dunn looked around at the faces that had once respected him, feared him, obeyed him without question. Now they looked at him with disgust and hatred, and he realized his carefully constructed world had finally collapsed completely. This isn't over, he said weakly. I'll find a way out of this. No, you won't, Amos said quietly. Because now everyone knows exactly what you are. And they'll never let you hurt another child again. As the crowd began to disperse, some of them taking charge of the wounded deputy, others offering help to Jane and the children, Eli found himself standing alone with Jane in the gently falling snow. "It's over," he said simply. "Is it?" Jane looked exhausted, but there was something new in her eyes, something that looked like hope tinged with disbelief. "Done's finished. The truth is out. You're free." "Am I?" She touched her scarred cheek reflexively. "People will still remember what they called me. They'll still whisper behind my back about the witch who lived among them. Some will. But others will remember what you really did. How you risked everything to save children who had no one else in the world. And you, what will you remember?" Eli looked at the children gathered around them, Amos proud and strong, despite everything he'd endured. The twins no longer holding each other in constant fear. Little Sarah, with her slowly healing arm. The other children who were finally truly safe. And Ruthie, who was still in Jane's arms, still calling her Mama, in that small, clear voice. "Idaker, I'll remember," he said, "that someone has to stand up for the innocent. Someone has to protect the children who can't protect themselves. Someone has to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. And you'll remember that you don't have to fight alone anymore." Eli smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. "No, I don't have to fight alone anymore." 4 months later, Eli Callahan stood in the doorway of his greatly expanded cabin and watched Jane O'Rourke teaching the children to read from a book of fairy tales. The addition he'd built over the winter gave them plenty of room to grow, to heal, to become the family they'd chosen to be. They were all healthier now, stronger, happier. Amos had grown 4 inches and was starting to laugh regularly, his premature seriousness giving way to moments of genuine childhood joy. The twins had learned to play again, and their laughter echoing through the house like music. Sarah's arm had healed properly, and she was becoming quite the artist with her sketches of the Colorado wilderness. And Ruthie, sweet, brave little Ruthie, chattered almost constantly now, as if making up for all the months of enforced silence. She called Jane Mama and Eli Papa, and seemed determined to ask every question that had ever occurred to her young mind. "She's making up for lost time," Jane said, coming to stand beside him at the doorway. "They all are. What about you? Are you making up for lost time too?" Eli looked at her, really looked at her. The scar on her cheek would always be there, and her hands would always bear the marks of her difficult life. But her eyes sparkled with happiness now, and when she smiled, it transformed her entire face into something beautiful. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I am." Dr. Webb had been appointed permanent sheriff of Devil's Backbone after the territorial investigation concluded. He'd also formally cleared Jane of all charges and had begun recommending her medical services to families throughout the Colorado Territory. Liza Walton had surprised everyone by proposing a partnership with Jane to establish a proper medical practice, serving both the town and the mining camps. The 2 women had discovered they made an excellent team, Liza's knowledge of local politics and Jane's extraordinary skill with difficult cases. "The territorial marshal sent word yesterday," Jane said. "The corruption investigation is complete. Dunn's been sentenced to life in prison, and 3 mining company executives are facing charges." "Good. The new regulations for child labor in the camps go into effect next month. No children under 12 mandatory schooling, regular inspections. It's a start. More than a start, it's hope that things can actually change." That evening, as they sat around their expanded dinner table, Eli made an announcement that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking about making this official," he said, looking at each of the children in turn. "About legally adopting all of you, giving you my name, making you true members of this family." "All of us?" Amos asked. "All of you. But only if that's what you want." If any of you would prefer to try finding other relatives or going somewhere else. This is our family, Amos said firmly. You and Jane and all of us together. This is where we belong. All of us feel that way, Eli asked. All of us. The children said in unison, their voices blending together like a choir. Then it settled. Eli looked at Jane, who was crying openly now. We're a family, official and legal and permanent. A real family. Ruthie added, climbing into Jane's lap. With a mama and a papa and lots of brothers and sisters who love each other. The best kind of family, Jane said, hugging her close. The kind that chooses to be together. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Eli and Jane sat by the fire and talked about their future. Do you ever wonder, Jane asked, what would have happened if you'd turned us away that first night? I try not to dwell on what ifs. But do you? Eli considered the question carefully. Sometimes. But then I remember that some things are meant to be. Some people are meant to find each other even in the darkest circumstances, even if it nearly killed us all. Especially then. The things worth having in this life are always worth fighting for. Jane leaned against his shoulder, and he could feel the tension finally leaving her body. I love you, Eli Callahan. I love you too, Jane O'Rourke, soon to be Jane Callahan if you'll have me. I can't think of anything I'd want more. Neither can I. As they sat there in the warm glow of the fire, with 8 children sleeping safely in their beds, Eli reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain, the fear, the desperate fight for survival against overwhelming odds. But also the courage, the love, the simple truth that someone has to stand up for the innocent. Someone has to protect the children who can't protect themselves. Someone has to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. And sometimes, if you're very blessed, you discover that you don't have to fight alone. 1 year later, Deputy Silas Dunn died in territorial prison, not from violence, but from the consumption that had been eating away at his lungs for years. The mining companies had been forced to completely reform their practices under strict territorial oversight. New laws protected children from exploitation, and regular inspections ensured compliance. Jane O'Rourke Callahan was officially commended by the territorial government for her heroism and awarded a medal for her service to the community. She was also granted a full pardon and a formal apology for the false charges brought against her. But she always said the real reward was the family she'd found. The 8 children now, the 8 Callahan children, thrived in their new life. They all grew up understanding the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, of fighting for justice, even when it was dangerous, of choosing love over fear. Amos became a lawyer, dedicating his career to protecting children's rights and prosecuting those who would harm them. The twins started a successful business together, always looking out for each other and their employees. Sarah became a teacher, her gentle nature helping other traumatized children find their way back to hope. The other children found their own paths, but they all carried with them the lessons they'd learned about courage, compassion, and the power of chosen family. And Ruthie, sweet, brave little Ruthie, grew up to become a doctor, inspired by the woman who'd saved her life and taught her that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Jane continued her work as a midwife, her reputation for skill and compassion spreading throughout the territory and beyond. She delivered hundreds of babies, saved countless lives, and never once charged more than a family could afford to pay. Eli never forgot the pain of losing his first family, but he learned that love wasn't something to be hoarded or protected. The more you gave, the more you had to give. And in protecting Jane and the children, he discovered that his own wounded heart was capable of not just healing, but of becoming stronger than before. They were married in the spring, with all 8 children standing as witnesses and half the territory in attendance. It was a simple ceremony held in their own front yard with Dr. Webb officiating. Even some of the people who'd once called Jane a witch came to celebrate, bringing food and gifts and heartfelt apologies. As the years passed, the story of the Witch of Copper Creek became legend throughout the Colorado Territory. But those who knew the truth understood that there had never been any witchcraft involved. Only a woman brave enough to save children. Others had abandoned a man strong enough to protect what mattered most, and a family bound together not by blood, but by the unbreakable bonds of love and choice. And every night, as they gathered around their table for dinner, they remembered the lesson that had brought them together, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to look away when others are suffering. Someone has to stand up for the innocent. Someone has to protect the children. Someone has to fight for what's right. And when you find others who share that sacred commitment, you discover that you're not alone. After all, your family.